So we're opening our third discussion series episode on energy diplomacy this year. And this episode is on the impact of the European Green Deal and carbon border adjustment mechanism on Russia. We have a very distinguished guest speaker today. The discussion is going to be led by Vice President of Eastern Circles, Gabriel A, who is going to present you, the guest speaker, and moderate the discussion. We are going to start with the speaker's own presentation, then continue with moderated discussion until 6 p.m. Central European time. And then we're going to switch to Q&A. So if you do have questions, please put them in chat. You are going to have an opportunity to ask them personally after 6 p.m. as the moderated part of the discussion nears to the close. So with that, Gabriel, to you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Thank you very much all for being with us today. We're going to discuss, as Anastasia just said, the impacts and opportunities for Russia of the European Union green policy. So to address the context, as you may know, the EU targets carbon neutrality by 2050 as part of its Green Deal. It also aims at a 55% reduction of its CO2 emissions by 2030, thanks to the Fit for 55 package. Within this framework, the Commission plans to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, also called CBAM, in order to tackle carbon leakage and avoid environmental dumping abroad. And in doing so, the EU not only positions itself as a normative and economic power involved in CO2 reduction, but also as a geopolitical power in regards with the impacts of those tools on the EU trade partners. And this is precisely the topic of today's conference that we're going to discuss with our guest speaker, Igor Makarov. Igor, thank you very much for joining us today from Moscow. So as I just said, we're going to study with Igor the impact of the Green Deal and CBAM on the Russian GDP, exports and employment. But we will also analyze the perception of those tools by the Russian business and political elites and the population. And finally, we're going to talk about the possible and potential areas of confrontation and cooperation projects between the EU and Russia on climate issues. So to go back to our guest speaker and introduce him as he should be, let me share with you some biographical elements, and thank you once again, many thanks to have accepted to speak at our conference. Igor Makarov holds a PhD in economics. He is currently head of the School of World Economy of the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He also directs the Laboratory for Climate Change Economics and works as the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies in the same university. We can also say that he has previously been a visiting scholar at Stanford University and Harvard University. He has been teaching at the University of Tehran and at the Autonomous University of Madrid. Overall, his research interests cover environmental and climate change economics, international political economy, globalization, as well as Asia-Russian relations. So thank you very much for taking the time, Igor. We're really honored to have you today. And as Anastasia has mentioned, we would like first to give you the floor for a short 10 minutes presentation in which you would be able to, give us some elements of context, but also to share with us some conclusions of the report that you have just published and that you've realized and written with the World Bank about Russia's green transition, the risk and the policies. So Igor, the floor is yours. And I know that you wanted to share some slides with us, so please go ahead.
Oui, bonjour. C'est un honneur pour moi de prendre la parole à ce séminaire aujourd'hui. But now I'm of course switching to English because my French is not so good, and I think that it would be easier for everyone anyway to speak English. So I hope you see my slides nowadays. Now Do you see it in full screen, right? Okay, so yes, my presentation would be about the impact of the European Green Deal and especially of CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, on the Russian economy. And it is based on the report which we just published together with the World Bank. Here is the cover of this report. So it is a report that highlights the risks and opportunities which appear in front of Russia due to the decarbonization of the global economy, not only of the European Union, but of the global economy. But of course, one of the risks is associated with the European Green Deal and CBAM. And we, in this report, we have a lot of modeling exercises where we, together with our colleagues from the World Bank, modeled simulated different scenarios of global decarbonization and looked at how in these scenarios Russian economy would be affected. Russian exports, the welfare, employment in Russia, output in different sectors, and so on. We used the general equilibrium model, which is called envisage model, and so this is the global computable general equilibrium model, which just looks at all the countries of the world, all the major sectors segregated, of course, into some groups, and Russia in this model is considered as one of the region which is quite convenient for our tasks. So the very problem it originates on the fact that Russia is very dependent on fossil fuels. It is one of the most fossil fuel dependent countries among all the largest economies of the world. Russia is the world leading producer of oil, gas, and coal, one of the leading exporters of oil, gas, and coal. And of course, it makes Russia very vulnerable to the trends of the greening of the global economy. That's why some risks appear in front of the Russian economy, and these risks should be estimated. And on the other hand, some motivations, some incentives should be found for Russia to move towards green development, because it is not so easy as somewhere in the European Union, for example, which is the importer of fossil fuels. That's why there is much more motivation to move to the green direction, because environmental motivations and altruistic motivations are supplemented here by geopolitical motivations of decrease of dependence on imports of fossil fuel. In Russia, this motivation is of course absent, and so on the other hand, Russia is not very much motivated to accelerate the green transition just because of the structure of its economy. So here is a slide that shows that the very Russian economic growth is very much dependent on the dynamics of oil prices, which shows the extent of dependence of the Russian economy on fossil fuels, actually. You may see that Russia developed very, very rapidly in the 2000s, in the first decade of the 21st century, until the crisis of 2008, 2009. And it was, at the same time, it was a period of very rapidly increasing oil prices. And so it was one of the factors of the economic growth in Russia, without any doubt. After the crisis of 2008-2009, Russian economic growth decelerated. So Russia recovered from the crisis by 2010, as most of the other countries of the world. But after that, Russian economy started to stagnate. And after 2012, all the years until the last year, until the beginning of the corona crisis, Russian economy developed slowly than the world average. And so in Russia, it is often considered as stagnation. And so this stagnation, it is also partly determined by the dynamics of oil prices, because in 2014 the oil prices dropped, and it was a shock for the Russian economy, and the Russian economy dropped into the negative zone of economic growth, and actually did not recover fully from that crisis of 2014, 2015. So the whole dynamics of economic growth in the 2010s, the period when oil prices were not so high, especially in the second half of this decade, so show that Russia is really dependent on the state of the global oil, gas, and general fossil fuel market. This is another picture that also shows the huge dependence of Russia on fossil fuels. It is the structure of Russian exports last year. You may see that more than the half of Russian exports is consists of mineral products. So it is actually fossil fuels, primarily oil and gas, partly coal as well. But even the other half of the Russian exports, it consists of very energy-intensive sectors. It is metals, it is chemicals, it is wood, pulp, and paper. All these sectors are very, very energy-intensive. And these sectors are especially vulnerable, especially exposed to CBAM. All this makes Russia vulnerable to at least two types of transition risks. So the risks of green transition, which affects especially the fossil fuel dependent countries. In the short term, the major risk for Russia is really CBAM, but it is also in the only in the short term. Of course, in the longer term, much more serious risks are associated with the reduction of demand for Russian fossil fuels, and related industries, the production of related industries, and corresponding decrease in welfare. So our report, it estimated these two types of risks. I think that I should not stop in too much detail on the rules of CBAM. They were declared preliminary, actually, by the European Commission on the 14th of July this year. And this mechanism, it suggests that the additional the carbon price would be imposed on imported goods, especially from countries which have no carbon regulation within their borders, such countries as Russia. I can't say that right now the rules of CBAM are very, very strict. They cover only scope 1 emissions, not scope 2 emissions. Probably in later the scope, the exposure would be expanded to scope 2 emissions, but now it covers only scope 1 emissions. It covers only 5 sectors which are most vulnerable to carbon leakage. It is cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and electricity. And even within these sectors, not all the goods are covered by CBAM, but in most of the sectors, most of the goods, but not all of them. So CBAM is paid by the importer, not by Russian or Chinese companies, but they are paid by European companies which import goods from Russia, China, the United States, some African countries, or anywhere else. Well, and the volume of these payments is calculated based on the carbon price within the EU ETS, which is now about 80 euro per ton, which is quite high by historical standards, and probably later it would be even higher because the ambitious objectives of the European Union to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030, they require the higher prices of CO2 within the European market, of course. Which is what is important is that if an exporter, if an exporting company already pays carbon price in their own country, in their home country, for example, Russian company pays carbon price in Russia, so this carbon price is fully deducted from the CBAM payments. So it's this point was considered by the European regulator as an incentive for partner countries to introduce carbon price within their own borders. And in principle, it creates some incentives for the Russian government as well to impose carbon price within Russia in order to decrease the payments to the European budget, but to collect this money to the Russian budget. Well, what are the results of our estimations? Actually, we do not expect that CBAM would be a huge risk for the Russian economy, that it would be the catastrophe for the Russian economy. According to our estimates, even if scope 1 or scope 2 is covered, which is not the case right now, but even if scope 2 would be covered, the loss of Russian exports to the European Union would be about 7% by 2030-2035. It is the exports of Russia to the European Union, not the total exports of Russia to the whole world, but also only to the European Union. If only scope 1 is covered by CBAM, which is the case right now, then the losses of Russian exports to the European Union would be about 3%. Moreover, partly these losses would be compensated by the rise of exports to other jurisdictions. For example, to China, to other Asian countries, to the United States, actually, so to other countries except the European Union. In 2035, we expect that the model shows that the decrease of Russian exports to the European Union in case if scope 2 is covered would be about $19 billion. But at the same time, Russian exports to other regions would increase by about $11 billion. So part of the losses of Russia in the European market would be compensated by the rise of exports to the other markets. So there would be some redistribution of export-import flows globally, and that would help Russian companies to mitigate the losses. So actually, if we convert it to the losses of GDP and to the welfare of Russia, the losses would be very low. It would be like 0.02% of Russian welfare by 2035. So really nothing. But at the same time, it doesn't mean, of course, that for specific industries, it wouldn't be painful. For some industries, it may be rather painful, especially for those companies which are oriented to the exports to the European Union. For example, for chemical products, the loss of exports to the European Union may be up to 60%. For electricity, up to 30%. For ferrous metals, like 20%, and so on. So for specific companies, for specific industries, and for, of course, people who work in these industries, it may be painful. But for the whole economy, it is unlikely that the EU CBAM would be very, very painful. The other experience, the other exercise that we made within this report was the modeling of the impacts of decarbonization globally on the Russian economy. And of course, this type of risk, including the risks which appears due to the European Green Deal, because the European Green Deal is one of the parts of this global decarbonization. So this part of risks is actually much more painful for the Russian economy, especially in the longer term. So we simulated 4 scenarios within our report. So one scenario, we modeled the carbon price globally, including in Russia. So Russia cooperates with other countries in introduction of carbon price. We also simulated the scenarios where carbon price is introduced at the level which is consistent with 2 degrees objective of the Paris Agreement, only in climate policy leaders. Climate policy leaders are energy importing countries, the European Union, the United States, and China, especially, but also by some other energy importing countries like Japan, like India, like Australia, Japan, India, South Korea, and so on. So only we looked at what would happen with Russian exports and GDP if only climate policy leaders would introduce carbon price, because they are the most motivated. in terms of introduction of carbon price. Then we looked at what will happen with Russian exports if all these climate policy leaders will introduce carbon price, which is consistent with this 2 degrees goal. But they will also introduce border carbon adjustment, which is quite logical for them, because their logic is that if we introduce high carbon price, but do not introduce border carbon adjustment, so our emissions would leak to other countries like Russia. So for them, it's quite logical to add this border carbon adjustment in order to prevent carbon leakage. And finally, we also looked at the scenario if higher carbon price would be introduced globally, so which is consistent with 1.5 degree objective. So what would be the result for Russia, results for Russia for Russian exports? It is shown in this slide. Of course, in each of these scenarios, the Russian exports of fossil fuels would decrease after 2030. In some, in the coming decades, starting from 2020 to 2030, the oil exports from Russia may increase in some scenarios. But in the longer term, of course, the exports of all of the Russian fossil fuels would decrease dramatically, which is quite logical. It is interesting that for Russian oil producers, the optimal strategy is the cooperation strategy, when carbon price is introduced not only in climate policy leaders, but also in Russia. Why? Because so if carbon price is introduced only in climate policy leaders, it means that they would accelerate the green transition, so carbon price would be higher in these leaders, and for them it would mean that the changes in transport sector should be much quicker than in alternative variant when carbon price is introduced in the whole world and it would be not so high. And if the changes in transport sector would be quicker, then it means that the demand for Russian oil would decrease probably. So for Russian oil companies, it is better if carbon price is introduced everywhere, including in Russia, than if carbon price is introduced unilaterally by largest carbon fossil fuel importers, including EU, the EU, the US, Japan, China, and so on. But of course, in all the scenarios, the Russian exports of fossil fuels would decrease. And here, what it means for the Russian welfare, of course, the lowest losses of Russian welfare happen in the so-called unilateral scenarios. So in the scenarios when only climate policy leaders would introduce carbon price. So these are orange scenarios here in this slide. So if Russia does not introduce carbon price, but all the other countries introduce carbon price, then it means that Russia may win from carbon leakage. So Russia may attract some carbon-intensive products to Russia to increase its production, to increase its GDP. So losses for Russia wouldn't be so high. So orange scenario are the most preferential for Russia. But if climate policy leaders would add border carbon adjustment just to the unilateral measures for decarbonization, this would lead to the gray scenarios, which are the worst possible for Russia. Then these opportunities associated with carbon leakage no longer exist, and Russia would lose huge numbers, actually 9% of its welfare compared to the baseline scenario by 2050. And actually, if we exclude this unilateral scenario when other countries introduce carbon price, Russia does not introduce carbon price, but all the other countries are okay with that, so they do not introduce border carbon adjustment. So if we exclude this scenario, among all the other scenarios, for Russia, the best option is cooperation, actually. So the introduction of carbon price globally, including in Russia. So this would lead to the blue scenarios. They are also not very good for Russia, but they are better than gray scenarios of unilateral climate policies of climate leaders together with body carbon adjustment from climate leaders. So actually all these pictures show what would happen in Russia if Russia does not do anything special, if Russia does not make any efforts to mitigate these risks. So if Russia is more active in terms of coping with these risks, in terms of facing these risks, so the results may be different. For example, here we modeled two scenarios of introduction of carbon price in Russia in response to CBAM. So if Russia introduces carbon price at the level of the European Union as a response to CBAM, so what does it mean? It means that Russia faces any risks associated with its exports anymore, because Russian carbon price is deducted from the CBAM payments. So Russian companies do not pay anything to the European Union, but they pay within the country. So, and we simulated two scenarios which are different in one parameter. So this one parameter is what would be done with revenues that are accumulated as a result of CBAM introduction, of carbon price introduction. So Russia introduces carbon price, Russian government accumulates a lot of revenues due to this carbon price. What would it do with these revenues? There are two options, two polar options. The one option is to give all these additional revenues to households, so to redistribute all these revenues to just directly to households, to support the living standards, to support the level of consumption, and so on. The second polar option is to convert all these carbon revenues to investment and to stimulate investment, to stimulate economic growth. Actually, of course, the reality, if carbon price is introduced in Russia, the reality is somewhere between. So these are two polar options which are impossible in real life, but it shows two polar variants. Again, the reality is somewhere in between. So the difference is huge between these two options, and it shows that not even the level of carbon price actually matters, but what would be done with revenues that are accumulated with this carbon price. If revenues are recycled to households, then it is shown by orange lines. Real GDP wouldn't grow too much, but the household incomes, household consumption, it should not fall too much as well. Real exports would increase compared to the scenario with no carbon price. Real investment would be at the same level. If Russia recycles all these carbon revenues to investment, then we have a different picture. We see the huge increase of real investment. We see the huge real GDP growth, but at the same time, we see the huge decrease in the household consumption. So if Russia recycles all these carbon revenues from carbon price to investment, it stimulates economic growth, but it decreases living standards of population, which is socially maybe quite dangerous. But it shows the real choice which Russian government has. So it may stimulate economic growth by accumulating, by introducing carbon price and recycling these revenues to investment, or it may support the living standards by introducing carbon price and recycling these revenues to consumption, to households. So this is actually the basic choice. And the final slide, actually, what would be with long-term Russian welfare if Russia starts to diversify its economy? So this figure shows the two options of diversification. The first option of diversification is so-called traditional diversification. It is what Russia did for the last 20 years, actually. It tries to shift from the production and exports of raw fossil fuels to the production of exports of energy-intensive goods. Petrochemicals, gas chemicals, metals, fertilizers, and so on. So this is traditional diversification. And the second option is asset diversification. It is what would be if Russia diversifies towards other competitive advantages from fossil fuels and fossil fuels related industries to the industries which are not associated with fossil fuels at all, to those which are based on human capital, natural capital other than fossil fuels, which are based on innovations, R&D, and so on. So, of course, this asset diversification scenario shows the best output, the best results. So, among all the scenarios, the scenario with diversification is shown by blue line and yellow line. These are only scenarios which show the rise of Russian GDP and welfare compared to baseline scenario. So if Russia diversifies in response to green transition, global green transition, in response to the EU CBAM, in response to the EU Green Deal, and in response to measures introduced in other economies, so Russia has an opportunity to even increase its GDP compared to the business as usual, because green transition may give Russia some opportunities as well. But it is an opportunity only if Russia implies asset diversification. So if it diversifies from fossil fuels and fossil fuel dependent sectors to non-fossil fuel dependent sectors. Actually, diversification, traditional diversification from fossil fuels to energy intensive goods, it actually makes the situation even worse. So it is shown by orange and gray scenarios, so it does not work at all. So it would not be sufficient in the decarbonized world. Only asset diversification, so concentration on the sectors which are not related to fossil fuels, would give Russia an opportunity to grow faster than in business as usual scenario. But it is still possible. It is still possible, and our report shows that. So the results that we got at the very end is that the participation in international cooperation together with the asset diversification, which is actually the very primary priority for Russia in this context, of global decarbonization, it provides the best outcomes among all the combination of scenarios. So this is a short summary of our report. I am sorry that I spoke a little bit more than I should, but I will be happy to answer all the questions and probably to speak not only about the models and simulations and numbers, but also about politics of green transition in Russia, which I suggest you are also interested in.
Thank you very much, Igor, for this very insightful presentation. So following those elements, I have some questions for you. First of all, maybe some questions to, complete this depiction of the global picture that we have, that we need to have of the Russian economy and of its environmental policy. So first of all, maybe a question regarding Russia's CO2 emissions. So how do they compare to the BRICS, to the emissions of the BRICS and of the OECD countries today? And following this question, second one, and I'm going to explain why did we think about this question. We know that the progress of curbing CO2 emissions is calculated comparative to the base levels emitted in 1991. Which is finally a big plus for Russia, since that's exactly when its GDP went down by 40% and when the industry came to a standstill. So finally, does it give Russia a competitive advantage in CO2 reduction vis-a-vis over developing economies? And finally, what does it tell us about the efforts that Russia has to make to reach the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, actually, Russia reduced its emissions dramatically compared to the 1990, which is the base level of the Kyoto Protocol, and which is still considered as a base level within the UNFCCC. So Russia really reduced its emissions by 31% if we do not consider land use changes and forestry. So if we do not consider forests, and by 48% if we consider forests. So the absolutely dramatic decrease in emissions. It is the largest absolute decrease of emissions among all the countries, actually, which Russia sometimes underlines during the negotiations. It is its strength within the negotiations. Of course, we should understand that not all of these emissions emission reductions were not the result of any climate policies. Actually, most of these emission reductions was the result of just a transitional crisis of 1990s. Of course, but at the same time, it is also not true it is not quite correct to say that it is only the result of this dramatic fall of economic activity in the 1990s. After the 1998, so the lowest level of Russian GDP started to grow very fast. I shown it, especially in the 2000s, but emissions still stayed at more or less the same level. So Russia, it's shifted to the other trajectory of economic growth, to the other structure of economy. Russia introduced a lot of measures to modernize its economy, to modernize its energy sector, electricity sector especially. In the 2000s, it dramatically increased its energy efficiency. And it resulted also to the fact that despite the very rapid economic growth in the 2000s, the emissions did not restore to the level of 1990. So, of course, partly it was a result of crisis of the 1990s, partly it was the result of the modernization of the Russian economy in the 2000s. But yes, mostly this emission reduction was the result of some structure of some shifts within the economy, but not of the active climate policies. I don't think that Russia may use this emission reduction as any advantage. Probably diplomatically, yes, it may be beneficial. But in terms of commercialization, in terms of attraction some investment to the Russian economy, or in terms of preventing these risks that I mentioned in my presentation, I don't think that it really matters. Yeah, because what really matters is the carbon footprint of Russian companies which export abroad. What really matters is the demand for Russian fossil fuels, which is not done domestically by Russian, but it is determined by the policies and the dynamics of the economies of other countries. So that is what actually matters for the Russian economy. So diplomatically, it may be the advantage, again, but economically, I don't think that it may be commercialized somehow, or it may prevent any risks. I mean, the fact that Russia really reduced emissions dramatically compared to the 1990s.
Thank you very much. So as a follow-up question on the matter of the economic risk and opportunities, I have a question which is based on something that another Russian economist has stated, Sergei Guriev. So he has stated that in all those oil producer and gas producer countries, any economic diversification, and we can understand by this also the efforts made to reduce and mitigate pollution, CO2 emissions. So any economic diversification cannot really be implemented as long as oil and gas prices are very high, because the cost of diversifying the economies are still too high compared to the benefits of doing and implementing those changes. So my question here is, has Russia really and definitely jumped into the train of the efforts to mitigate climate change, or is there a way back, since we see that gas prices are now reaching, I mean, summits. And I mean, so is Russia really going to try to mitigate its carbon footprint, or is there a way back? And I mean, to complete this question, what are the governmental priorities? Because we've been talking about modernization of the energy sector. We've been talking about reforestation. I know that in Russia, there've been also some talks about the carbon capture, utilization and storage. So what are the priorities of the Russian government now?
I think that we should first consider separately some short-term and long-term trends. What we have now in gas prices, of course, it matters, but it matters firstly in short term. So it is short-term story anyway. The gas prices will be lower in the future than the current level, of course. So I don't think that it is a very, very long-term story. As well, for example, when oil prices dropped dramatically towards zero last year, it was also a very short-term story. So nowadays they recovered to the more or less normal levels. I think that in the long term, of course, these long-term trends really matter, and these long-term trends, they are anyway towards decarbonization, which is very uneven across the globe. It is uneven also in time. So in some years, it may be slower. In some years, it may be faster. For example, again, last year, there was some recovery in coal production. So it is also a short-term story. So it is also uneven across countries and so on. So, but still this trend to decarbonization, it continues, and it will continue in future. And again, in the long term, the only response, or only possible effective response to that is the diversification of the economy. And this diversification should not be only to renewables, as many people believe that, for example, Russia should shift from fossil fuels to renewables. I don't think that it is the only option. So Russia may have other comparative advantages not only in the energy sector. So there are many other sectors in which Russia may be specialized in, starting from agriculture and finishing with, I don't know, forestry, climate smart forestry, for example. Or some industrial production, or some metals, for example, which are used extensively in green transition, including copper, aluminum, nickel, lithium, cobalt, and so on. So there are many other comparative advantages which Russia may develop, and this is the level of, again, asset diversification. So diversification from fossil fuels as a comparative advantage to other comparative advantages, including innovations, including human capital, including other types of natural resources, including ecosystem services, and so on. So it is impossible, very difficult, and probably even impossible to name specific sectors which will, in which Russia will be specialized in 20 years. So some of them are obvious, like agriculture. Some of them are not even understood very well. But this diversification is anyway needed. What Russia sees, what the Russian government sees as comparative advantages in the future, and to what directions it moves mitigation efforts, to many different directions. And so the Russian official position is that we should be absolutely technologically neutral. We should not make our choice in favor of one specific technology. For example, renewables. So we should develop, Russia should develop some nuclear power as a nearly carbon neutral technology, very low carbon technology. We should develop CCS, as was said, carbon capture and storage, and Russian companies already develop some CCS project. We should develop climate smart forestry, So some forest projects which would increase the absorption capacity of forests and would increase the absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere. We should, of course, develop hydrogen. And Russia has a rather ambitious strategy to develop hydrogen sector. And we should develop, of course, energy efficiency, which is probably the most low-hanging fruit in Russia. So all these technologies, they work. So we should not make the choice in favor of one of them. So this is the official position. Of course, from the perspective of business, it is much easier to say that Russian forests would absorb everything and we should not decrease our carbon footprint itself. So this is position of some Russian businesses. That's true. So I think that the official position is a bit more balanced. Probably here, but again, we should not expect, and I think that it was declared many times in Russia already, that we shouldn't expect that just one specific technology, well, carbon technologies, should develop in Russia. No, there is a portfolio of different technologies, and each of them should be the part of this decarbonization efforts.
Thank you very much. Maybe to react to what you've just said, my question was also, my next question is regards the acceptability of those green policies and the motivation of the population, but also of the business and political elite. First of all, because, to me, the political and economic elite is also relying on the rent of the energy sector. So how acceptable is it somehow to really go towards this economic diversification that, let's admit it, that we've been talking about in Russia for the past 20 years. So how realistic is it? And second, coming back to what you've said during your presentation, talking about the very low motivation. So how possible is it now for the Russian government to, how can I say, to push the population, to ask the population to make some efforts to mitigate Russia's carbon footprint, regarding the fact that, there have been some, for some years we have been denying in Russia the existence of pollution, the existence of this reality. And maybe finally, how is the CBAM and the European Green Deal perceived in Russia? Is it perceived as a true, environmental policy, or is it also perceived and depicted as a political or geopolitical tool against some EU trade partners? How is it presented? Many questions, I know.
Different questions, but I will try to answer them. So first of all, I don't believe that the Russian population may be the driver of climate policies in Russia for many reasons. One, just because of the specifics of civil society in Russia, and its not very high role in the political life. Secondly, and probably even not less important, that climate change is not the priority for most of the population. Even if we speak about environmental problems and we ask population to rank them in terms of their severity, in terms of their priorities, so climate change would be number 7. There are some surveys that show that climate change is number 7, even among environmental problems, not just all the problems, but only environmental problems. Much more important for population are air pollution, water pollution, waste disposal, and so on. They are more important than climate change. I think that the major driver of climate change, of climate policies in Russia, is business. Because for business, it is already the urgent problem. Business already faces the requests of the investors, the request of their consumers, especially corporate consumers from abroad, the requirements of exchange of different trading platforms, the requirements of international regulations. They also see this regulation in the European Union. They see the effects of CBAM. So they see that this is already here. These risks are not in 10 years or in 20 years. They are already here, and they really should do something with that. And so after the business is concerned of all these developments, government also starts to be concerned. And for the last year, we see the huge expansion of climate-related debate in Russia. I myself participated in more seminars and different conferences with participation of businesses and with the participation of the government representatives. For the last year, I participated in larger number of these events than for all my previous life, I think. And so it really became one of the priorities of the government, especially of the Ministry of Economic Development, not because of climate itself, but because of the risks that the government really sees nowadays in the global landscape. And CBAM, of course, played a very serious role here. I shown in my presentation that CBAM is not so horrible for the Russian economy. So the losses from CBAM are not very high. They are actually from small to negligible for the Russian economy, depending on the scenario, on the specific design of this mechanism. But it was a strong signal. It was a strong signal that these risks are already here, that they happen already now, not in 10 years as many Russian policymakers believed before, when the demand for Russian fossil fuels start to decrease. But they are already here, and they should be somehow addressed. So probably these risks are not so dramatic, but even if they are not dramatic, still these are losses for companies. Still, this is a strong signal to the governments that EU government can't arrange the issues in the manner that Russian companies should pay to the Russian government, but not to the European government. So this is a strong challenge for the Russian government itself. It shows that it would probably be a failure if Russian companies really would pay, not directly, of course, but through importers, but would pay to the European budget rather than to the Russian budget. So it is perceived in Russia, and I am shifting to the other part of this question. It is perceived in Russia as a challenge to the Russian government and to the Russian business, first of all, and this challenge, and it is also the challenge of Russian economic sovereignty, even, because this is some regulation which comes from abroad, which is not developed by Russia itself, but which comes from abroad. And so this is a threat, this is a challenge that should be addressed. Yes, it is often considered as a geopolitical tool. And many people in Russia and many businesses in Russia believe that this is a part of the protectionism, that the real objective of CBAM is the protectionism. Very few people understand that the objectives of CBAM, that it is actually the domestic issue of the European Union, and so if climate policy in the European Union becomes more and more ambitious, if free allowances within the EU ETS are lifted, so the European companies would accept all this only if they are protected from the competition from abroad. Very few people in Russia really understand that. Many people believe that it is just the protectionist measure. This is, by the way, one of the my own claims to the CBAM. I don't think that this instrument is, frankly speaking, is very, very efficient. And what is more important, that this instrument, of course, it brings the part of confrontation to the Russia-European climate relations. The agenda, which probably could be one of the very few areas between the EU and Russia which could be cooperative, it also becomes confrontational. Partly it is a matter of communication, so Europeans should better explain to Russians for all this appears. But also this is a matter of substance as well. So of course it can't, but is perceived in Russia as a geopolitical tool rather than just the instrument of leveling playing field. Well, I'll stop here.
Thank you. So maybe another a question to answer to what you just said. Since the effects of CBAM are not to be that important, and it's true that you've been talking about the redirection of Russian exports, for instance, from Europe to Asia, how big and how realistic could this option be? And maybe another thing, which sectors would be targeted? Which sector would find the most opportunities on the Asian markets?
Well, I think that most of these sectors would, the trade flows within most of the sectors which are covered by CBAM, they would be redirected, not only from Russia, but everywhere. So the very mechanism of CBAM, it suggests what? It suggests that European importers would choose among all the assortment of the products those which have the lowest carbon footprint to pay less, right? So it means that the least low carbon, the most low carbon products would go to the European Union. But it means that to the other jurisdictions, more carbon intensive products would go, including from Russia. So I think that this reshuffling, it would happen in all the sectors, probably excluding electricity, because it is, of course, geographically allocated and it can't be redistributed to other countries. But except for electricity, all the other goods covered by the CBAM, the flows of them would be redirected anyway. What is even worse for climate, actually, and from the perspective of the efficiency of CBAM, and it is not caught by our model, but it would also happen, that there would be also the reshuffling within Russian exports. So Russian companies would direct to the European Union the less carbon-intensive products and would leave the most carbon-intensive products domestically in the domestic market. So that is absolutely senseless from the perspective of climate and emission reduction, but it is quite logical response of Russian companies. So they would send to the European Union relatively less carbon-intensive goods, and so all the others would stay in the Russian market, not even to the other markets, but in domestic market. This is also one of the huge problems of the CBAM, at least in the design which was proposed in July.
Thank you very much. Then to keep talking about the internal market, we know that talks have been ongoing about putting a price on carbon and about the creation of a carbon market in Russia. So where does Russia stand now? And also, if a carbon market were to be created in Russia, would it be inspired from a European model? How would it be done? Like, do you have any insights about what's going on right now? In the talks?
For the last years, the number of laws and different strategies and other normative documents were passed in Russia, and among them is the law on carbon emissions reduction. And this, it is called on control on carbon emissions, something like that. So this law actually does not suggest any carbon price or any other active regulation measures that create incentives for companies to reduce emissions. So it creates only the statements that make Russian companies monitor and verify and disclose information on greenhouse gas emissions. So which is also necessary, actually, because without understanding where emissions are, where they are generated, by which companies, in which regions, no any carbon price may be introduced. But it is only the first step. So the carbon price should be the next step. Whether would it be done or not, it is not clear yet, unfortunately, because right now the federal government is not ready to introduce carbon price at the federal level. What it really does, it incentivizes different regions to introduce their regional carbon prices. And the first region of that type was and is Sakhalin region, where the first pilot project of carbon pricing is being launched right now. So carbon price in Sakhalin with quite ambitious objectives to achieve carbon neutrality by 2026. This carbon neutrality is calculated in a little bit strange way, and it may be argued how really ambitious it is. But still, it is the first pilot project at the regional level, and I hope, and there are some real prerequisites to some preconditions for that some other regions would join that, and probably carbon price would try it first at the regional level, and then in somewhere in 5 years, probably it would be expanded to the national level. I don't think that the European Union, that the model of the emission trading system of the European Union is appropriate for Russia, frankly speaking. The reason is that Russia has absolutely other very, very different tax fiscal system. Russia has a lot of energy taxes already. Russian energy taxation is quite developed, active, and it covers a lot of nearly all the energy produced in Russia by taxation already. And I think that the way how Russia should develop carbon pricing is to integrate the elements of carbon pricing, quasi-carbon pricing, into the energy taxation. So to make some maneuvers in energy taxation in order to create incentives for companies and for consumers to choose those sources of energy which are less carbon intensive, to reduce the consumption of energy and promote energy saving and energy efficiency in this aspect. But I don't think that just carbon price should be imposed on the Russian economy in addition to the existing energy taxes, because it would be quite very serious step, and it may have a lot of social and economic consequences, including negative consequences. But tax maneuvers within the energy sectors, they are quite possible, and they may be very, very efficient, actually. The opportunity that is absent in the European Union because it has no such a system of energy taxation already, because it does not very few, very small share of the European economy is in the energy sector, while in Russia it is huge. So this opportunity is absent in the European Union, but it really exists in Russia. So why not to use it? So at least to start. And then probably already the emission trading system may be added to these tax maneuvers, but I don't think that it should be the scheme with which Russia should start.
And why precisely Sakhalin? And also, what do you mean by the fact that measurement system is quite? I mean, I guess you said quite strange, or I mean that. What do you mean by this? And finally, maybe how to make sure from the EU that the measures taken by Russia regarding the fact that there could be some tax maneuvers or different maneuvers, how do we make sure that those measures align with the EU standards and fulfill somehow the EU requirements, which is in the end, which is in the end fulfilling environmental objectives? Mm-hmm.
Okay, Sakhalin started this process just because the region wanted to do it itself. The Sakhalin economy is based on the two huge energy projects, which are directed primarily by Western companies, Shell and BP. And these Western companies declared their objectives to become carbon neutral. For them, movement towards carbon neutrality is part of their strategies already. And for this reason, it was not very difficult for them on the one hand and for the government of the Sakhalin region to institutionalize these efforts that have already been planned. That's why Sakhalin agreed to be the first region that started all this story. And the carbon leakage from Sakhalin to other regions is negligible, would be negligible, while some other regions that could be interested, they are afraid of carbon leakage within Russia. So they are afraid that if they introduce, for example, carbon tax, so the companies would move from this region to some neighbors. In Sakhalin, which is very isolated and which is based on the natural resources, so it is not such a problem. It is because it is why Sakhalin started all this. How the carbon neutrality is calculated? It is calculated in a very strange way, really. So the carbon neutrality in the Sakhalin perspective, from the perspective of the Sakhalin government, is the point when carbon emissions are equal to absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere by the ecosystems of the region. So they just calculated the volume of CO2 that are absorbed by Sakhalin forests and compared it with the volume of emissions which are generated in the region. So the difference is about a little bit more than 1 million tons of CO2. So the objective is to reduce this 1 million ton of CO2. And they say that it is carbon neutrality. It is not the way how carbon neutrality is calculated usually at the international level, because not the total volume of absorption really matters, but the change of absorption due to different climate projects in forestry. So it does not mean that Sakhalin forests, they absorb, I don't know, 10 million tons of CO2 if they absorb the same 10 million tons of CO2 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and so on. So if there is no change in absorption capacity, so it should not be taken into consideration because it does not affect the volume of CO2 in atmosphere. If the volume of absorption increases from 10 to 11, for example, it means that this 1 million should be taken into consideration in the efforts as the efforts of the region. But they take into consideration all these 10 million tons of absorption, which is not quite good from the perspective of international standards. As for the question about the linking of Russian approaches to decarbonization with the European ones, I think that it is an important question. And yes, it would be much easier for everyone from the perspective of linkage and from the perspective of comparison of different standards if Russia just use the same template of carbon regulation as in the European Union, so just introduce the ETS. In Russia, of course, it could be more comparable. But at the same time, we should understand that each country has its own specifics. Yeah, and so these specifics should also be reflected in the approaches to greenhouse gas emissions regulation. If it is not carbon price in pure way, but quasi-carbon price, which is integrated to the existing energy system, I think that it should be taken into consideration anyway. So the most importantly is that this regulation should be additional. It should not be the substitution of one regulation to the other regulation, which has the same effect. But if this regulation really creates the new incentives for companies to reduce emissions, it leads to the emission reduction. So I think that it should be considered as an efficient way of emissions regulation, even if it is not called carbon price. Well, because carbon price is not the pure carbon price. It is not the only way to regulate emissions anyway. It may be the cheapest way, yes, in theory, but probably it may not be the cheapest way in practice first, because it may be more difficult to introduce it from the political perspective, for example, on the other hand, on the one hand. And so also it may well, neglect some specifics of the economy of the country where it is introduced. In this case, I'd say that all the means, all the instruments of emissions regulation which really work, they should be taken into consideration, and I hope that the European Union in the future would be also more flexible in considering that.
Thank you very much. So now I guess we should turn to our audience for the Q&A session. We have already received some questions, and I would like first to give the floor, if you agree, to ask your question directly to Igor, to Willy Breda, if you would like to take the floor and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Gabriel, to give me this opportunity to react and to ask a question. Let me please first thank Mr. Makarov, of course, for his very nice presentation. It was quite interesting. I mean, there are several scenarios that were clearly explained. And last but not least, it was quite appreciated to remind the overall objective of the CBAM, which is the CO2 reduction, and which is not a measure of protectionism that we often hear from the Russian side. So it was really, really appreciated to hear that from you. Thanks a lot. My question concerns a certain part of the equation. When you assess the impact of the CBAM, you took into account several scenarios. So the fact that other countries in the world introduce the same kind of measure, of course, there is an impact for exports. You also take into account the cost of the CO2, of course, because it is clearly linked. But it was not clear if you took into account the CO2 emissions of industries and the fact that these emissions could be reduced because of the improvement of industrial process, for example. I mean, for me, it is quite strange to hear that the impact of a CBAM, which is, as you said, a measure to limit the CO2 emissions, with financial results only. I mean, what I would have expected is also to have a clear view on the impact on the CO2 emissions. And from your point of view, have you assessed that on the Russian area? I mean, have you taken into account several scenarios, for example, the reduction of 10%, of 20%, or 30% of certain industry, or not? Because it was clearly interesting to see that if, for example, Russia implements a certain carbon market, this amount could be used to invest in several areas, but it was not clearly mentioned in the CO2 reduction. And in Russia, you have an objective of carbon neutrality by 2060. It is not clear how we will reach this target. Actually, we will probably expect news probably in February next year. But still, we have a room for maneuver to build several scenarios concerning the CO2 reductions. So have you taken into account this aspect in your study or not?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your question. Actually, yes, we calculated the effect of global regulation and introduction of global carbon price and introduction of carbon price in other countries, introduction of carbon price in other countries plus CBAM in other countries to Russian emissions. Of course, if global carbon price is introduced and Russia also participates in that, so the level of carbon price in these scenarios was considered at the level which is consistent with 2 degrees target. So, and if also Russia joins these efforts, so by definition, it would mean that emissions in Russia would decrease by nearly zero, not to pure zero by 2050, but to nearly zero. And more or less, this scenario is consistent with what the President Putin declared in October, that Russia would achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Of course, it is very, very ambitious targets, frankly speaking. And I personally do not believe that Russia understands nowadays, that anybody in Russia understands nowadays how it may be achieved. In the model, these targets, this scenario just suggests that if carbon price is introduced at a very high level, like $200 per ton globally, so it would accelerate the development of green technologies in all the sectors, and it would shift the structure of the economy towards greener sectors. And so in principle, it is possible to do it. In terms of the, even given the technologies that already exist or at the level of introduction. But in practice, it would be, of course, very, very difficult to introduce carbon price by $200 per ton anywhere, not only in Russia. Even in the European Union, it would be quite very, very painful, and it would be not easy from the political perspective. In Russia, it would be even more difficult from the political perspective. In developing countries, emerging economies would be even more difficult than in in Russia. So in the scenarios of global carbon price, if Russia joins all these global efforts, so Russian emissions go to nearly zero by 2050. In other scenarios, if Russia does not participate in global efforts, and if other countries do not introduce CBAM, Russian emissions would increase even. That is logical, because all the carbon-intensive products would move to Russia, and Russia would increase its emissions. If other countries would introduce CBAM, Russian emissions would decrease, but not so rapidly as in the scenario when Russia introduces carbon price itself. So you may find the figure. I don't have the figure in my presentation with emissions in the different scenarios, but you may find it in the report. So yes, we calculated the effect of all these scenarios on emissions in Russia. But all these scenarios, they achieve anyway 2 degrees. The difference is that they achieve 2 degrees due to the cooperative efforts in all the countries, including Russia, or they are achieved unilaterally due to unilateral efforts by climate policy leaders. That is the difference. But all the scenarios, they lead to 2 degrees. Unfortunately, there are also maybe scenarios when 2 degrees are not achievable, but they were not taken into consideration in our study because the task was a little bit different. The task was to see what would be with the Russian economy if this decarbonization really happens. For me, it is not the fact that it would happen in such a pace as it is suggested to achieve 2 degrees.
Thank you very much. So now I would suggest to give the floor to 2 persons on a row. So we have a question first from Vadim Kuznetsov and then from Pauline Millet. So if you could ask briefly your question, and before that, introduce yourself, reminding us in 2-3 words, where do you come from and who you are?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gabriel. Hello, Igor. Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Vadim Kuznetsov. I'm a fourth year bachelor student at MGIMO University in Moscow, and I have also been a student delegate to COP26 this year. So my question is, recently some Russian officials have declared that there is a need to create a common carbon regulation framework at the level of the Eurasian Economic Union. And it would be a certain measure to respond to the CBAM. So in your vision, what are the prospects of this initiative? Would it move forward in any form? And if yes, then how useful is it?
Thanks for your question. It's quite, it's very, very relevant. Yes, there is some discussion about the synchronization of climate policies within the Eurasian Economic Union. I think that this may be separated into two parts. First, it is the climate policy itself, so like carbon price or any other measures to regulate emissions within these countries. I think that the policy of this type, it may be hardly expanded to the whole Eurasian Economic Union because it is out of the mandate of the European Commission. So a lot of bureaucratic work should be done to include it to the mandate of the European Commission. And I do not see the interest groups who are really very interested in that. And without this introduction of this climate policies of carbon price introduction and other issues into the mandate of the European Commission, it can't be done just technically. So I think that this part, it can't exist, except for some supplementary issues like, for example, there may be just common green taxonomy within the Eurasian Economic Union. So it is not regulation itself, right? It is just supplementary analytical tools, supplementary measures that may be referred only also to at the national regulation at each of these policies. So it may be done. The second issue is the climate trade policy. So, for example, the synchronized response to CBAM. So, for example, when all the countries of the European Union, they introduce export tariffs, additional export tariffs to the carbon-intensive goods, the objective of which is to gather these revenues from the companies ourselves, but not to let companies to pay to the European Union. It is more possible from the perspective of, from the more like regulatory perspective or from the normative perspective. It may be done at the level of the European Union. The question is whether it is really efficient, because the problem with export tariffs as a response to the European Union is the fact that, well, let's start from the other side. So the general effect of CBAM, it may be separated to two components. The first component is that the price at the European markets on energy-intensive, carbon-intensive goods, it would increase as a response of CBAM. Anyway, so some of the payments of CBAM, it would be paid by European consumers anyway. The second part of CBAM, the second effect of CBAM is that producers from other countries, including Russians, for example, they would also, they should decrease their profits as a response of CBAM. So this is the second component. So when you introduce export tariffs within Russia or within the Eurasian Economic Union, so you address only the second component. You do not address the first component. So anyway, as a response of CBAM and lifting of free allocations, free allowances in the emission trading system within the European Union, the price of carbon-intensive goods in the European Union would increase anyway. So, for example, if importers pay 60%, 60 euro per each ton of CO2, well, say 30% of this 60 euro, 30 euro from this 60 euros, they would go to the consumers. 30 euro from this 60 euro would go to producers. But if you introduce export tariff in the scale of, again, $60, your exporters pay first $60, and they also face the high price of their goods in the European market. So they become much less competitive than in the absence of this export tariff. That is the problem. So probably these additional export tariffs, in addition to CBAM, they would undermine the competitiveness of Russian exporters to the European Union, because they anyway would pay twice, actually. They would lose because of the rise of consumer prices on the one hand, and they would lose because of the export tariffs on the other hand. So that's why I have some doubts that export tariffs is the right response to CBAM, because it may undermine the competitiveness of Russian and Eurasian exporters in the European market. But in principle, it may be introduced at the level of the Eurasian Economic Union. The question is whether it is efficient and whether it is the right, appropriate response. But it may be introduced.
Thank you very much. Actually, we're already running out of time, but I see that we have 2 more questions. Igor, would you find time to answer those? Yes. So I guess I'm going to give the floor very quickly to Pauline Millet and then to Christophe Fellner. We have 2 questions from those two people, and then we'll let you time to answer. So Pauline first, please.
So hello, thank you for the conference. I'm a former transport student, and my question is, you have addressed a lot the risks, and do you see at the moment opportunities of cooperation between the European Union and Russia? I think especially to hydrogen that both sides want to develop. So do you see projects that are active in this domain at the moment?
Yes, thanks for this question. It is, of course.
I'm so sorry, then let's take the one, I'm sorry, sir, let's take the one of Christophe, and then I will let you answer on the rules that we can. So Christophe, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, my question would be with regard to carbon storage. As I've heard that at the moment, Norway actually thinks about using the money gained out of oil producing to actually invest it into carbon storage. So would Russia follow that example in the near future? Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Thanks. I will start with the second question. It is shorter, probably. Yes, so there are some projects of CCS in Russia. And for example, just a week ago, Gazpromneft declared that it would start the CCS project in the Orenburg region. And some other oil and gas companies, they study these opportunities, and I think that CCS projects will appear in Russia in the near future. The difference with Norway is that usually the oil wells and or other reservoirs where CO2 may be pumped, in Russia, they are often very far from the consumers where the emissions are generated, where the fossil fuels are burnt and emissions are generated. Russia is much larger than Norway, right? And so in Russia, there are not so many areas where these reservoirs, which are available for CCS, are near the areas where fossil fuels are consumed and burnt. So Orenburg region is one of these regions. Tatarstan is the other region where also CCS may be quite prospective. As for the opportunities for cooperation between Russia and the European Union, Yes, hydrogen is one of the obvious areas of cooperation. The problem with hydrogen is that Russia and the European Union can't come to the like common vision of how hydrogen should work and what hydrogen should be developed, because Russia wants to develop hydrogen based on nuclear, for example, but the European Union does not want hydrogen based on nuclear. They want to buy hydrogen, green hydrogen, so-called, based on renewables. But for Russia, it also may be developed, but Russia considered this as the next step, but not now. But hydrogen based on nuclear, but hydrogen based on gas, they are not very much welcomed by the European Union. That is the problem. Even if hydrogen is produced from gas with CCS, so when it is more or less carbon neutral, even in this case, the European Union is not very happy about that. But Russia really declares the so-called color neutrality of hydrogen. So it does not recognize this classification of hydrogen by color. For Russia, Russia says that Russian official position is that it does not matter what color the hydrogen is, color, of course, from the perspective of with which technologies it is produced, but it only matters what is the carbon footprint of the hydrogen produced as a result. So if hydrogen based on nuclear is carbon neutral, so it should be used. If hydrogen based on gas with CCS is carbon neutral, it should be used, and it should be equal to the hydrogen based on renewables. Yes, and actually the most important opportunity of cooperation, coming back to your question, is based on the very clear fact that there is a huge asymmetry between Russia and the European Union in two issues. The European Union is the region which has a lot of available green capital, and it is relatively cheap. But in the European Union, there are very few opportunities to cheap emission reduction. That's why you have already carbon price 80 euro per ton. And in the future, it would be even higher and higher. So you have a lot of capital, opportunities to invest in green projects, willingness to invest in green projects, but no green projects, no cheap green projects. All the next green projects would be more and more expensive. In Russia, you have absolutely different situation. We have a lot of green projects. We have a lot of opportunities of cheap emission reduction. We also, in our report, we published the figure which shows that it is cheaper to reduce emissions in Russia than in any other country in the world except China and India. It is super cheap to reduce emissions in Russia. But the problem is that we have no cheap capital, especially cheap green capital, which is willing to be invested to green projects. So we have huge asymmetry here, and we have huge complementarity. So Europe has capital, but no green projects. Russia has cheap green projects, but no capital. So let's reduce emissions in Russia with the European capital. So this is the solution. Of course, it is not politically feasible in the European Union, I understand that. But of course, some intermediate steps may be introduced. So the opportunities for the European companies to reduce emissions in Russia as the offsets within the emission trading system of the European Union. It is opportunity. Of course, not all the 100% of emissions of the allowances, but say 10% of the allowances. It may be done conditionally. Of course, it may be this regulation, this opportunity may be provided to the European companies if Russia introduces like carbon price. Okay, let's make it conditional. Let's limit it to the specific sectors. If you do not want forest projects, okay, let's do not use these opportunities in forest projects. But however, I think that most of the opportunities, they lay here in this area. So it is much cheaper to reduce emissions in Russia than in the European Union. It means that more emissions should be reduced here for the same price. For climate, it is good. For European companies, it is good because, again, they would pay less for the emission reduction. For Russian economy, it would be good because it would attract investment. So for everyone, it is good. Well, the problem is the like political feasibility of this mechanism, and of course the fact that the European Union doesn't want to reduce emissions anywhere except for the European Union, because European Union reduces emissions not only to reduce emissions, but also to launch green jobs, to develop technologies, and so on and so forth. But however, the opportunities here, they appear, they should be used. Not again, don't go to the like, don't be super ambitious here, but at least something should be used in this area. Some of these opportunities should be used in this area.
Thank you very much, Igor, for your presentation, all the information that you shared with us tonight. It was a pleasure to have you here. And I would like to say many thanks to our audience as well. And to let you know that our next event will be dedicated to the future of petrostates and will be held in an hybrid format within the French National Assembly. So details to come, stay tuned, and we'll let you know everything about our future events. Thank you once again, and I wish you all a very good evening and Merry Christmas.
Thank you so much, and Merry Christmas to everyone.